Welcome back to History to Snooze By, where the past drifts by like a quiet dream. Tonight, we begin a long, peaceful journey through the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, a boy born on a distant island who would one day crown himself emperor. His story is one of storms and silence, of cannon fire and candlelit rooms, of triumphs that shook Europe and exiles marked by fading footprints. But you are not here for battle cries or rapid marches. You are here to rest, so I invite you now to lie back. Let your hands relax at your sides. Let the weight of the day slowly fall away. Take a slow, deep breath, and another, and let the stillness of the night welcome you. As you listen, feel free to drift into sleep whenever you're ready. The story will continue gently on without you. And if you enjoy these soft journeys into history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more, and leave a comment about where we should travel next. Now let us begin. Chapter 1. Corsica and the Child of Revolution. The island of Corsica, in the late 18th century, was a place caught between identities. Nestled in the Mediterranean Sea, it sat closer to Italy than to France, and for centuries had been governed by Genoa. The landscape was rugged and wild. Mountains rose from the coastline like stone guardians. Olive groves, vineyards, and small villages dotted the hillsides. In the air, the scent of sea salt mingled with the dry aroma of sun-baked earth. The people were proud and stubborn, with a fierce sense of independence. They spoke a dialect that sounded more Italian than French, and many still dreamed of autonomy. In the city of Ajaccio, among its narrow streets and whitewashed buildings, a child was born on August 15, 1769. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was the second son of Carlo Bonaparte and Lady Ramolino, members of minor Corsican nobility. His birth came just months after France had formally taken possession of the island from the Genoese, after years of unrest and rebellion. Napoleon's arrival into the world was quiet and unremarkable, as most births are. But the world he was born into would shape him in profound ways. He came into life in a household full of children, noise, and constant motion. His mother, strong-willed and resilient, managed the home with a stern hand. His father, educated and ambitious, sought favor with the new French rulers while clinging to Corsican pride. From an early age, Napoleon lived in two worlds. In one, he was a French citizen, sent off to the mainland for education, absorbing the language and customs of a country that did not fully see him as one of its own. In the other, he was a Corsican boy, raised with stories of Pasquale Paoli, the island's legendary leader who had resisted French control. These stories left a deep impression. For many years, Napoleon saw Paoli as a hero, even a father figure. His early schooling in Corsica was modest. He learned arithmetic, Latin, and the rudiments of French, though his accent would remain strong for life. Teachers noted his seriousness, his sharp mind, and his tendency to be withdrawn. He often preferred books to play, and silence to chatter. His imagination was captured by tales of Roman glory and ancient generals. History, even then, seemed to speak to him not as a distant subject, but as a guide, whispering of future paths. When he was just 9 years old, his father secured him a scholarship to a French military academy on the mainland, the Royal Military School of Brienne. It was a long way from home, and the separation from his family was difficult. The journey alone, crossing the sea, and traveling inland was filled with strange sights and unfamiliar voices. At Brienne, Napoleon stood out. He was shorter than many of the other boys, quiet and serious, often mocked for his Corsican accent and manners. But he was determined. He read constantly. He excelled at mathematics and military theory. He studied maps the way others studied faces. In time, some teachers recognized his potential. He was not always liked, but he was respected. There was a quiet force in him, a focus that did not waver. The years passed, and with them came news from Corsica. His father, Carlo, died when Napoleon was still a teenager. The loss affected him deeply. It meant the family would have to rely even more on Napoleon's future. He began to feel the weight of expectation, not just for himself, but for his mother, his brothers, and sisters. At age 15, he was admitted to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, where he completed his training in just 1 year instead of the usual 2. Shortly after, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the French artillery. He was still just a teenager, barely out of school, now wearing the uniform of a nation whose people still treated him as an outsider. Life in the officer corps was not glamorous for someone of his modest means. He could not afford the fine clothes or social circles of many of his peers. He often spent his free hours alone, walking the streets of Paris, visiting bookshops, studying ancient campaigns, and writing reflections on power, war, and leadership. He wrote with intensity, sometimes arrogance, always with certainty. Meanwhile, the world around him was changing. France was no longer stable. The old order, the monarchy, the privileges of the nobility, the rigid structure of class was beginning to crack. Hunger spread through the cities. Anger simmered in the countryside. Enlightenment ideas whispered of liberty and rights, and more voices were beginning to shout. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Napoleon was just 20. At first, he watched from the sidelines, uncertain of what it might mean. But soon, the revolution would become the defining backdrop of his life. Back in Corsica, the tides of politics were shifting as well. Paoli, once exiled, had returned and was now in conflict with France. Napoleon found himself torn. He had long admired Paoli, but now they stood on opposite sides. Napoleon, committed to the revolution and to France, could not follow a path of Corsican separatism. It was a painful break, and it would never truly heal. His loyalty to revolutionary France, however, would soon offer him opportunities. In 1793, he was sent to help retake the city of Toulon, which had been seized by royalist forces and handed over to the British. It was a critical moment for the revolutionaries. Napoleon, though still junior in rank, proposed a bold plan to position artillery on high ground overlooking the harbor. His strategy worked. The British fleet was forced to withdraw, and Toulon fell back into French hands. This was the moment that changed everything. He was promoted to brigadier general at just 24 years old. The government noticed him. His name, once spoken with unfamiliarity and hesitation, now passed between ministers with interest. He was no longer simply the Corsican outsider. He was the young general who had saved Toulon. The revolution continued to rage. Factions rose and fell. The guillotine claimed lives every day in Paris. Yet Napoleon kept moving forward. His ambitions grew. He believed in the revolution, but also saw in it the chance to carve a place for himself. He had no fortune, no title, no lineage that mattered. What he had was his mind, his discipline, and his growing skill as a commander. He spent months writing military papers, refining tactics, proposing reforms. His ideas were sharp, often ahead of their time. He imagined armies moving like chess pieces, precise and coordinated. He saw battle not as chaos, but as a puzzle to be solved, a moment where logic and boldness could tip the scales. By the time he was 26, he had already risen far. But the road ahead would lift him to heights even he might not have imagined. And yet, even then, even in those early days, there were signs. The certainty in his gaze. The way he carried silence like a weapon. The way he watched, learned, and planned. In every camp and city, in every quiet moment between orders and actions, he was preparing. Not just for the next day, but for history. The boy from Corsica had entered the great theater of Europe, and the world was beginning to take notice. Chapter 2: The Gunner of Toulon. The year was 1793, and France stood on the edge of chaos. The revolution that had promised liberty, equality, and fraternity was now devouring itself. The streets of Paris echoed with cries of vengeance and cries of hope, often indistinguishable from one another. The king had been executed. The queen followed. Nobles fled or hid. Bread was scarce. Fear was not. A new order had begun, but no one yet knew what it would become. Across the land, civil war smoldered. Foreign armies gathered at the borders. In the south, the coastal city of Toulon had turned against the Republic. Royalists there had opened the port to British ships, inviting their former enemies to protect them from revolutionary wrath. The harbor, one of the most important in all of France, was now in the hands of enemies both within and without. To the leaders in Paris, this was intolerable. Toulon had to be retaken, quickly and at any cost. Troops were dispatched. Among them was a young artillery officer whose name was not yet widely known, but whose mind burned with plans and precision. Napoleon Bonaparte, still only 24, arrived in the besieging army's camp that autumn. The situation was grim. The Republican forces were disorganized. Their commanders argued and hesitated. The British Navy dominated the harbor. The city's defenses were well positioned, and most attempts to breach them had failed. Morale was low. The cold was beginning to set in. But Napoleon saw something different. He walked the ridges above the town. He studied the slopes, the enemy lines, the placement of guns and fortifications. He observed the movements of the British ships and the rhythm of the enemy's fire. He took notes. He made sketches. He calculated angles. While others saw a difficult siege, he saw a map waiting to be solved. His proposal was bold and simple. Take the high ground. Specifically, he identified a promontory called Fort Mulgrave, a strong point known to the enemy as Little Gibraltar. It overlooked the harbor and protected the British fleet's anchorage. If Republican artillery could be placed there, the ships in the bay would be vulnerable. The city, suddenly exposed, would become much harder to defend. Everything depended on controlling that single point. Getting there would not be easy. The British and their allies held the fort tightly. The terrain was steep and guarded, but Napoleon's plan, once explained to his superiors, was approved. Supplies were gathered. Cannon were moved, dragged by manpower through mud and stone. A slow and exhausting process. Trenches were dug. Batteries were built. In the nights before the final assault, Napoleon barely slept. He walked among the men, inspected the gun crews, studied the wind. He adjusted firing positions and offered quiet encouragement. Though still young and not yet a general, he carried himself with calm command. Those who served under him often recalled his stillness, the way he did not panic, the way he listened before he spoke, the way his eyes seemed to measure everything. The assault began in December. The fighting was intense. Gunpowder hung in the air like smoke in a blacksmith's forge. Cannon roared across the hills. Men charged and fell. Mud turned red. The fort was fiercely defended, but the Republican troops pressed forward under cover of artillery fire. Napoleon's batteries struck the British ships in the harbor, their shells falling with increasing accuracy. The defenders began to waver. The British, sensing the danger, began to withdraw. After days of fighting, Fort Mulgrave was taken. The harbor was no longer safe for the British fleet. They abandoned Toulon, burning ships and stores as they left. The city fell. The Republic had reclaimed its crucial southern port. For his role in the victory, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. He had proven himself not only a skilled officer, but a visionary tactician. The newspapers began to mention his name. In the government halls of Paris, officials took note of the young Corsican with a mind for artillery and a talent for turning desperate odds. Toulon was more than a military success. It was the beginning of something larger, a reputation, a myth, a rise. But the world Napoleon returned to after Toulon was still far from stable. France was in the grip of the Reign of Terror. Revolutionary leaders, led by Robespierre and the Jacobins, ruled with an iron hand. Accusations flew like leaves in a storm. The guillotine became a daily presence. Anyone suspected of disloyalty could be arrested, tried, and executed. Fear was not only in the streets, it lived in every whisper, every silence, every glance. Napoleon, ever cautious, kept his distance from the political bloodletting. He was not a man of speeches. He did not seek to wrap himself in revolutionary slogans, but he understood the currents of power and stayed close enough to survive. He took a post in the army of Italy, stationed in the south. There, he wrote treatises on warfare, polished military doctrines, and continued to refine his ideas of how an army should move and fight. He paid attention to logistics, to morale, to the rhythm of campaigns. He believed that mobility was key, that speed and surprise could overcome even larger forces. These ideas were not yet widely adopted, but they would soon define his campaigns. Then, in 1794, Robespierre fell. The reign of terror ended. New factions rose. Paris became a shifting ground of alliances, plots, and uncertainty. In the confusion, Napoleon was briefly arrested, suspected of being too close to the Jacobins. It was a dangerous moment. For several days, he lingered in uncertainty, waiting to see if he would share the fate of so many others. But the charges were dropped. He was released, and once again, his career seemed poised to stall. For months, he found himself without a command. He remained in Paris, out of favor, underpaid, and unsure of what would come next. He rented small rooms, lived simply, and waited. He read. He walked. He watched. He kept to himself. The city was full of people chasing power, but Napoleon, as always, played a longer game. Then, in October of 1795, came the call. Royalist supporters were marching on Paris. They intended to seize control, overturn the revolution, and restore the old monarchy. The city's leaders, desperate and disorganized, needed someone to organize a defense, fast. A member of the government named Paul Barras, who had seen Napoleon's work at Toulon, recommended him. The young general accepted. His plan was swift and direct. He requisitioned artillery, dozens of guns, placed strategically along the streets near the Tuileries Palace. He positioned his men carefully, creating a kill zone in the heart of the approach. On the morning of October 5th, the Royalists arrived. Thousands strong, they surged forward in a wave of chants and banners. But they were no match for trained cannon. Napoleon gave the order. A single round was fired, and then another and another. The sound echoed through the city. The Royalist advance collapsed. Later, this moment would be described with a phrase that stuck. Napoleon had delivered a whiff of grapeshot. With a few well-placed blasts, he had saved the government and the revolution from counter-revolt. The reward came quickly. He was made commander of the Army of the Interior. He became a figure of national importance. His name was no longer just in military reports. It was in newspapers, salons, and the quiet discussions of those who tracked power. He began to move in higher circles. It was around this time that he met Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow of noble birth, elegant, older than him, with 2 children and a reputation for charm. She was connected, socially adept, and politically astute. Their courtship was brief. They were married in 1796. Their union was complicated, full of passion, distance, and infidelity on both sides. But for Napoleon, Josephine represented something he had long lacked: entry into Parisian society, a sense of belonging beyond the uniform. Soon after the wedding, Napoleon was given command of the Army of Italy. It was, on paper, a backwater post. The army was poorly supplied, badly equipped, and demoralized. Its officers bickered. Its soldiers were hungry. But Napoleon saw in it an opportunity. He traveled quickly to join his troops. He spoke to them directly. He told them that while they were hungry and cold now, they would soon march through rich lands. He promised them glory, and more importantly, he made them believe it. He reorganized the ranks, disciplined the officers, and studied the terrain. And when he moved fast. His campaign across northern Italy would become legendary. With speed, surprise, and unorthodox tactics, he defeated larger Austrian forces again and again. He split their armies, outflanked their positions, and forced their commanders into confusion. He used propaganda brilliantly. He wrote dispatches that glorified victories, minimized setbacks, and elevated the image of the Republic. He became a hero not just of the battlefield, but of the press. His soldiers began to worship him. He learned to lead not just by orders, but by aura. In each town he passed through, he met local leaders, studied customs, and left behind new administrations. He was not only a general, he was a builder of order. By the time the Italian campaign ended, Napoleon was no longer merely a general. He was a phenomenon. In just a few years, he had risen from obscurity to prominence. He had passed through war, revolution, suspicion, and exile. He had seen cities burn and governments fall. He had walked alone, unknown and underestimated, through the heart of the revolution, and had emerged as one of its most potent forces. But his rise was far from over. There were other lands to march upon, other thrones to shake, and soon he would cast his gaze beyond Europe toward a land of pyramids, pharaohs, and desert winds. The boy from Corsica, the gunner of Toulon, the savior of Paris, he had only just begun. Chapter 3: The Italian Campaign. When Napoleon Bonaparte took command of the Army of Italy in March 1796, he inherited a force in poor condition. The soldiers were underfed, poorly clothed, and demoralized from years of inaction. Supplies were scarce. Pay was months overdue. Officers grumbled in private and laughed in public when they learned a young general, barely 26, had been chosen to lead them. But Napoleon did not waste time seeking approval. He arrived in Nice, headquarters of the army, and immediately began reshaping everything. He inspected units himself, asked direct questions, and reorganized the command structure. He dismissed officers he found incompetent and promoted those who showed promise, regardless of seniority. He didn't speak in vague ideals. He gave his men a goal. "You are hungry and naked," he told them. "The government owes you much, but can give you nothing. I will lead you into the most fertile plains of the world. Rich provinces, great cities, they will be in your hands. Soldiers with courage and endurance, victory will give you everything." He spoke not just as a general, but as someone who had once gone hungry. His men listened. Some were skeptical, but within days they saw results. Food arrived, boots were issued, plans were made. The Italian campaign would become the first major theater where Napoleon revealed the full extent of his military genius. He was not yet emperor, not yet famous across Europe, but in the valleys and hills of northern Italy, he would create the foundation of his legend. The Austrian army and its allies held strong positions throughout the region. The Piedmontese controlled the west, while the Austrians held the east. Napoleon faced a difficult geographic puzzle. The enemy forces were separated by the rugged Apennine Mountains, but they could join together if given time. To defeat them, he would have to move quickly, faster than either expected. He chose to attack the Piedmontese first. The roads were narrow, winding, and often cut through mountain passes. Rain turned the paths to mud. Supply carts struggled. Artillery crews fought to keep their guns moving. But Napoleon pressed on. He broke up the army into smaller columns, allowing them to move with greater speed. Scouts were sent ahead. Messages were relayed constantly. He knew exactly where his troops were and where they would be. At Montagnat, he struck with precision. The Piedmontese forces were surprised and thrown into disarray. Within days, another victory followed at Malesimo. then again at Dago. With each clash, Napoleon's reputation grew, not just among his enemies, but among his own soldiers. They began to believe that their general could see the battlefield like a chessboard, that he could read the enemy's mind, that when he said victory was near, he was not simply trying to inspire, he was stating a fact. The Piedmontese sued for peace within weeks. The first enemy had fallen. Next came the Austrians. Their forces under General Bolo waited beyond the Po River. Napoleon crossed it with bold speed. He seized bridges before the Austrians could react, forcing them into a retreat. At Lodi, one of the most iconic moments of the campaign unfolded. The Austrians held the far side of a long stone bridge across the Oder River. Their cannon faced the narrow span, making a frontal assault seem suicidal. Napoleon surveyed the scene. His officers hesitated. Some advised caution. Napoleon chose otherwise. He gathered his men, ordered a column to form, and led the charge personally. As the Austrians fired, French soldiers advanced over the bridge under a hail of musket balls and cannon blasts. Smoke rose in thick clouds. Men fell. But the column did not break. They reached the other side, shouting, firing, overwhelming the defenders. Lodi was not the largest or most decisive battle, but it was the moment when Napoleon saw something shift in himself. Years later, he would say that it was at Lodi that he began to believe he was destined for something greater, not just as a general, but as a man of history. He wrote to the Directory in Paris, carefully choosing words that presented him not merely as a commander in the field, but as a leader of vision and reform. He distributed printed bulletins to his troops, glorifying their efforts and promising further victories. He understood the power of narrative. He also began to reshape the territories he conquered. In Milan, he abolished the old noble councils. He seized church lands, imposed taxes, and formed new administrations staffed by locals sympathetic to French ideals. Art and treasure were taken and sent back to Paris, part war trophy, part propaganda. He met with artists, scientists, and scholars. He walked through libraries and galleries. Though he moved like a soldier, his interests stretched far beyond the battlefield. He wanted to be seen not just as a conqueror, but as a civilizer, someone who brought modern ideas and order. But the war was not yet over. The Austrians regrouped in the east. Their next general, Wurmser, marched south with fresh troops. Napoleon countered by doing what few thought possible. He moved his army across the mountains to block them. The maneuver took days, across harsh terrain, and under constant threat of ambush. But it worked. The Austrians were surprised, pushed back, and ultimately forced to retreat. Then, when another Austrian army entered northern Italy under General Alvingsee, Napoleon found himself surrounded. His forces were scattered. He was outnumbered. Supplies were running low. For most generals, it would have been a time to pause. Napoleon attacked. He divided his army into smaller forces, drawing the Austrians in separate directions. At Arcole, he faced a difficult crossing over marshy ground. The Austrian positions were well defended, and the French troops hesitated. Napoleon grabbed a flag, advanced into the water, and tried to rally the men himself. The symbolism was powerful. Though he was nearly shot and had to be pulled back, the sight of their general risking his life spurred the soldiers forward. Arcole was taken. Finally, after weeks of maneuvering and fierce engagements, Napoleon dealt a crushing blow at Reveille. The Austrians had sent yet another army, but it too was broken. The road to Vienna lay open. The Austrian government, alarmed and exhausted, agreed to negotiations. The resulting Treaty of Campo Formio, signed in October 1797, was a triumph for France. It granted them control of much of northern Italy and parts of the Low Countries. The Holy Roman Empire, once thought unshakable, had bent before the power of the Republic. For Napoleon, the Italian campaign was more than a military victory. It was his creation story. He had taken a ragged army and transformed it into a victorious force. He had outmaneuvered some of the finest generals in Europe. He had shown that with speed, clarity, and boldness, a smaller army could defeat a larger one. But he had also revealed something deeper, a sense of destiny. That he was not simply reacting to events, but shaping them. That he moved through history not as a passenger, but as its architect. When he returned to Paris, the crowds gathered to see him. Newspapers hailed his triumphs. Portraits were commissioned. Pamphlets praised his genius. He was still in his 20s and already the most famous man in France. The government, the Directory, welcomed his victories, but also feared his popularity. Power in revolutionary France was unstable. Leaders rose and fell quickly. Too much fame could become dangerous. Napoleon understood this. He remained polite, deferential, careful. He wrote letters praising the Republic, thanking the Directory, promising loyalty. But behind the scenes, he made contacts with bankers, merchants, and politicians. He studied the divisions within the government. He kept his options open. He was not yet ready to take control. Not yet. But he was thinking ahead, and then came an unexpected turn. The Directory, eager to send him away from Paris but still make use of his talents, offered him command of an expedition to the east, to Egypt. It was a bold and strange proposal. France had no pressing need for a campaign in Egypt. But there were reasons. It would strike at British trade routes. It might open the door to India. It would spread revolutionary ideals to ancient lands. And most of all, it would give Napoleon a new arena, far from the shifting factions of Paris. He accepted, not because Egypt was necessary, but because it was new. Because it offered adventure, challenge, and the possibility of shaping something vast. And because in the back of his mind, he already knew that the Mediterranean was not the limit of his vision. He had marched through Italy. Now, he would walk among the pyramids. Chapter 4: The Egyptian Adventure. In the spring of 1798, the ports of southern France stirred with activity. Ships were loaded with food, ammunition, scientific equipment, crates of books, and bundles of personal effects. Soldiers waited in neat lines beside their regiments. Officers moved back and forth, their eyes scanning documents, issuing quiet orders. Amid the clatter and wind, a fleet began to assemble, one of the largest France had ever launched. This was not a typical military deployment. Alongside soldiers and sailors were men in long coats with ink-stained fingers, mathematicians, engineers, artists, astronomers, and naturalists. They carried delicate instruments and fragile scrolls. They came not to fight, but to observe, study, and record. At the heart of this strange caravan stood General Napoleon Bonaparte, already a national hero, though still not 30 years old. His Italian campaign had made him famous. Now, he was setting out for Egypt, not only with an army, but with an idea. The purpose of the expedition was layered. Officially, it was to cut off British trade routes to India, undermining their empire at its root. Politically, it removed Napoleon from Paris, where his popularity was beginning to threaten the Directory. Culturally, it was framed as a civilizing mission to bring knowledge, reform, and progress to a land seen through European eyes as ancient and mysterious. But for Napoleon, Egypt was something more personal. It was a stage upon which he could stand alone. He would be far from France, far from rivals. In Egypt, every decision would be his. Every victory would bear his name. Every discovery, every policy, every structure built in the desert sand, all would reflect back upon him. The fleet departed in May 1798. Thousands of men sailed eastward across the Mediterranean, their ships catching the summer winds. They stopped in Malta along the way, capturing the island quickly, then moved on, watching the horizon with care. Napoleon was acutely aware that the British Navy, under the command of Admiral Horatio Nelson, was hunting them. The two men had never met, but already their destinies were beginning to circle each other. By clever maneuvering and favorable weather, Napoleon's fleet avoided interception and reached the coast of Egypt in July. The troops disembarked near Alexandria, their boots crunching onto dry earth. The sun beat down with unfamiliar intensity. The landscape stretched out flat and golden, broken only by stone ruins and the slow shimmer of heat rising from the dunes. The city of Alexandria, once a jewel of the Hellenistic world, was now a faded port under Ottoman control. Napoleon ordered its capture immediately. The attack was swift and brutal. The city fell within hours. From there, the French marched inland. Napoleon's goal was Cairo, the capital of Egypt and the seat of Ottoman authority in the region. But between him and the city lay the Mamluks, fierce mounted warriors who ruled Egypt with wealth and speed. Their cavalry was legendary, armored riders on swift horses, charging with curved sabers and elaborate dress. On July 21st, near the village of Mbaba, the two forces met in what would become known as the Battle of the Pyramids. It was not fought beside the Great Pyramids themselves, though they could be seen in the hazy distance. Instead, it took place on open desert ground near the Nile. The Mamluks charged with confidence. Their horses thundered across the plain, banners flying. Napoleon ordered his men into divisional squares, a tight formation of infantry with bayonets outward and artillery at the corners. It was a tactic designed for defense, a moving fortress of flesh and steel. The French held their ground. The Mamluks crashed against the squares and broke like waves against a cliff. Within hours, the battle was over. Thousands of Mamluk soldiers lay dead. The French losses were light by comparison. The road to Cairo was open. Napoleon entered the city in triumph. He issued proclamations to the local population, assuring them that the French had come as liberators, not conquerors. He invoked respect for Islam and spoke of ending tyranny. He tried to present himself as a friend to the people, but the Egyptians did not easily believe such words from a foreign army. Behind Napoleon's speeches were new taxes, forced labor, and the occupation of mosques for military use. Though he brought scholars and scientists, though he built roads and printed newspapers in Arabic, resistance simmered just below the surface. And then, far away in the Mediterranean, came disaster. On August 1st, Nelson finally found the French fleet anchored in Aboukir Bay near the mouth of the Nile. The Battle of the Nile was devastating. Nelson's ships attacked at dusk, catching the French by surprise. The British maneuvered between the shoreline and the anchored fleet, firing from both sides. One by one, the French ships were destroyed or captured. The flagship Lorient exploded in a fireball so large it lit the night sky for miles. By morning, the French navy in Egypt was gone. Napoleon and his army were stranded. There would be no easy return to France. The Mediterranean was now under British control. Supplies would be scarce, reinforcements unlikely. The dream of marching on India, already distant, vanished entirely. Still, Napoleon did not collapse. Instead, he doubled down. He reorganized the Egyptian administration, appointed French officials, and continued to issue bulletins praising the bravery and discipline of his army. He focused on internal reforms, building irrigation systems, launching studies of ancient monuments, and founding the Institute of Egypt, a learned society that would document everything from ancient hieroglyphs to modern weather patterns. The scholars he had brought began cataloging flora, fauna, and ruins. It was during this time that the Rosetta Stone was discovered, a slab of carved text in 3 languages that would eventually unlock the secrets of ancient Egyptian writing. Yet even as scientific progress continued, unrest grew. In October, the people of Cairo rose in rebellion. French soldiers were attacked in the streets. Mosques rang with cries of defiance. Napoleon responded with force. Artillery was brought into the city. Buildings were shelled. Hundreds died. The rebellion was crushed. but the cost was clear. Napoleon was not seen as a liberator. He was seen as a foreign ruler, one whose proclamations of friendship came at the barrel of a cannon. And then came more trouble. The Ottoman Empire, spurred on by British encouragement, declared war on France and prepared to invade Egypt. Troops gathered in Syria. A second army landed near Aboukir, hoping to reclaim control. In early 1799, Napoleon took the offensive. He marched north with a force of around 13,000 men, aiming to strike first. His campaign through Palestine and Syria would test the limits of his army and his ambition. Cities like Jaffa, Acre, and Nazareth became battlefields. At Jaffa, French troops stormed the walls. When they discovered that hundreds of captured Ottoman soldiers had previously surrendered and broken parole, Napoleon ordered their execution. Thousands were killed in a single day. The massacre shocked even his own officers. At Acre, his march stalled. The city, well defended and supported by British naval guns, resisted siege after siege. Disease spread through the French camp. Supplies ran low. Morale dropped. For the first time, Napoleon's momentum faltered. He withdrew, returning to Egypt in May 1799 with a weary and diminished army. Still, his legend endured. He won a final victory over the Ottomans at the Battle of Aboukir in July, repelling their second attempt to retake Egypt. The triumph restored some confidence, but news from France brought a new challenge. The political situation in Paris had deteriorated. The Directory was weak, unpopular, and beset by corruption. There were rumors of coups, plots, and collapses. Some whispered that France needed a new leader, someone strong, decisive, and untainted by the current chaos. Napoleon made a decision. He would return. It was a gamble. He would have to leave Egypt quietly, under cover of night, in a small ship with only a few companions. The British Navy still patrolled the sea. Capture could mean imprisonment or death, but the gamble worked. In October 1799, he landed in France. To many, he seemed to return from nowhere, like a ghost from myth, a savior stepping out of the east. His sudden reappearance stunned the political world. Crowds gathered wherever he walked. His name carried weight in every room. Soldiers cheered him. Civilians flocked to see him. Within weeks, he joined a conspiracy to overthrow the Directory. On November 9th, in what would be remembered as the coup of 18 Brumaire, Napoleon entered the chambers of power under the guise of protecting the government, but instead, he seized control. Some resisted. There was confusion, even panic. But by the end of the day, the Directory was dissolved. A new government was announced, a consulate with 3 leaders at the top. But only one mattered. Napoleon Bonaparte, first consul of France. The boy from Corsica had now returned from the sands of Egypt, not merely as a general, but as the most powerful man in the country. He had left behind a failed expedition, a broken fleet, and restless provinces. But he had returned with something more valuable, the momentum of legend. In Egypt, he had studied the ancients. In France, he would now write his own chapter in history. Chapter 5. The Coup of 18 Brumaire. Paris in the autumn of 1799 was a city brittle with tension. The air felt heavy, not with weather, but with unease. It was not the Christmas of falling leaves that dominated the streets. It was the silence between conversations, the sideways glances in crowded cafes, the low murmur of politics in every shadowed room. The revolution had changed France, but its end was not clean. The monarchy was gone. The guillotine had spilled enough blood to stain generations. Yet the new order, the Directory, was fragile and unpopular. 5 directors ruled the republic from tall chairs, but none inspired real confidence. They were seen as corrupt, inefficient, and self-serving, too weak to solve the nation's economic hardship and too divided to command loyalty. The military, once loyal to the idea of liberty, had become the real center of power. Generals returned from victories across Europe with wealth, fame, and influence. Among them, one name now towered above the rest: Napoleon Bonaparte. He returned from Egypt like a sudden storm, unexpected and impossible to ignore. The people cheered his name in the streets. Officers greeted him with respect beyond rank. Newspapers, ever loyal to public fascination, printed his words in bold. In salons, markets, and military barracks, the question was the same: what would Bonaparte do? He did not rush. He watched. He met with bankers, merchants, and former revolutionaries. He dined with generals. He wrote to political allies, gauging their loyalty. Though he had returned in secret, he did not hide for long. Within days of his arrival, he was at the center of Parisian life. France was weary of confusion. In Bonaparte, many saw clarity, a man who could bring order without returning to kings who could command without chaos. His very silence became part of his power. While others made noise, Napoleon measured the room. And in those careful moments, a plan began to form. The key players were already around him. Emmanuel Joseph Sayce, one of the directors, wanted to reform the government into something more stable and efficient. He believed France needed a strong executive, perhaps even a single leader. But he lacked the charisma to seize power alone. Napoleon had the charisma. Others joined the circle. His brother Lucien Bonaparte, now president of the Council of 500, one of the legislative chambers, would be essential. General Moreau, a respected military figure, offered quiet support. So did several influential members of the police and judiciary. The coup was planned for 18 Brumaire, year 8 of the French Republican calendar, November 9, 1799, in the Gregorian reckoning. It began with a fabricated crisis. Rumors were spread of a Jacobin plot, radicals seeking to overthrow the government and bring back the chaos of the Reign of Terror. The story was false, but believable. The people had seen enough real conspiracies to accept another. The Council of Ancients, the upper legislative body, was told it must be moved from Paris to St. Cloud, a small town west of the capital, for its own safety. The move was agreed upon. Soldiers were sent to guard the new location. Streets were blocked. Orders were signed. All appeared calm. Napoleon appeared before the Council of Ancients that morning. He wore his general's uniform, surrounded by grenadiers. He spoke of protecting the Republic, of defending liberty, of saving France from plots. His words were vague, but his posture was clear. He did not come as a servant. He came as a guardian or a master. The council, nervous but not yet defiant, accepted his presence. But the real test would come later, when the Council of 500 met. They were the lower house, more radical, younger, and more prone to passion. Lucien Bonaparte presided as their president. He was calm, poised, and fully aware of what was coming. When Napoleon entered the hall, uninvited and in full military dress, he was greeted with anger. Shouts erupted, "Down with the dictator! Death the tyrant!" Members surged forward. Some drew daggers. Others demanded his arrest. Napoleon hesitated. His voice faltered. For a brief moment, the coup teetered. He retreated from the chamber, shaken. Outside, he regrouped. Lucien emerged moments later, dramatic and composed. He addressed the soldiers gathered nearby. "My brother entered the hall to restore peace," he said. "The representatives inside are threatened by knives and violence. The safety of the Republic is in danger." He pointed to the chamber. "If any representative tries to dissolve this assembly by force, I call upon you to expel them." The soldiers, loyal to Napoleon, obeyed. They stormed the chamber. Chairs were overturned. Papers scattered. The 500 fled or were forced out. The legislature was dissolved, not by vote, but by boots. That night, a new government was declared. The Directory was abolished. In its place stood a consulate with 3 men at the top: Napoleon Bonaparte, Emmanuel Size, and Pierre Roger Ducos. But everyone knew the truth. Napoleon was now first consul, the dominant figure in the state. He moved quickly to consolidate power. He wrote a new constitution, the Constitution of Year 8, which reorganized the government under tight executive control. Elections were held, but heavily managed. The legislature became symbolic. Real authority flowed through Napoleon's hands. He presented the new order as a return to stability, not the birth of tyranny. He promised peace, prosperity, and law. The people, exhausted by a decade of war, revolution, and uncertainty, accepted the promise gladly. France needed calm. Napoleon provided it. In his first months as first consul, he worked tirelessly. He reformed the tax system, improving collection and reducing corruption. He reorganized the legal system. He created public institutions, lycées for education, a national bank, a new civil code in development. He did not dismantle the revolution. He absorbed it. He kept its language, liberty, equality, the rights of man, but reshaped its meaning. Where the revolution had been chaotic and collective, Napoleon's vision was orderly and singular. He placed himself at the center, not as a king, but as a guide, a shepherd of modern France. Abroad, he still faced enemies. Austria and Britain had not accepted peace. The Second Coalition continued its pressure. In 1800, Napoleon led a fresh campaign in Italy, crossing the Alps with his army in a dramatic and dangerous march through narrow passes. At the Battle of Marengo, he faced an Austrian army near defeat. For hours, it looked like the French would lose. Then, in the afternoon, reinforcements arrived. The French counterattacked. Victory turned in an instant. The wind secured northern Italy once again. His legend grew. He returned to Paris, a hero. Again. That same year, he survived an assassination attempt. A bomb exploded in the streets as his carriage passed. Civilians were killed. His vehicle was damaged, but he emerged unharmed. The attack only strengthened his authority. He responded by cracking down on radicals and conspirators. He expanded the powers of the police. He tightened his control over the press. Everything, he argued, was for the protection of France. Then came peace. In 1801, he signed a concordat with the Pope, restoring relations between France and the Catholic Church. It was a strategic move, not one of faith, but of unity. Religion, long a source of division, was now placed under state control. Churches reopened. Clergy returned. But all knew who stood higher: the state and its first consul. In 1802, he signed the Treaty of Amiens with Britain. For the first time in 10 years, Europe was at peace. France, tired of bloodshed, exhaled. In the calm, Napoleon moved again. A plebiscite was held, a national vote. The question, should Napoleon be made first consul for life? The answer, overwhelmingly, was yes. The Republic still stood in name, but the reality had changed. Napoleon ruled alone. He lived in the Tuileries Palace, surrounded by guards and advisors. He reviewed laws, received petitions, and issued decrees. He rose early, worked long hours, and accepted no excuses. He promoted talent from any class, so long as they were loyal and capable. He walked the gardens at dusk, often alone, his hands behind his back. He spoke little but remembered everything. He was no longer just the Corsican boy or the gunner of Toulon. He was something else now, the embodiment of order, the answer to revolution's questions, the man who had grasped the reins of a nation and refused to let go. And though peace held for now, he knew it would not last. Britain watched warily. Austria and Russia waited. In every capital, Napoleon's name was spoken with caution and sometimes fear. He had seized a government with hardly a shot. He had rebuilt France in months. He had turned uncertainty into purpose. But still, it was not enough. Because in the quiet of night, when the candles were out and the city rested, Napoleon thought not just of France. He thought of an empire. Chapter 6. The Rise of the Consul. By the year 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte, first consul of the French Republic, stood at the height of his influence. He ruled not as a monarch, yet more firmly than any king. His name, once associated with revolution and battlefield daring, was now linked to governance, law, and national stability. France, which had spun in circles for a decade, chasing liberty, spilling blood, tearing down and rebuilding, now moved in rhythm with his will. He worked long hours each day. He woke early, often before dawn, and began with reports. Ministers waited in silence outside his study, sometimes for hours, while he reviewed papers alone. His secretaries learned to keep quiet and write quickly. Napoleon dictated letters, orders, and policy like a man painting a canvas, fast, precise, always building toward a vision only he could see. He did not like disorder. He did not tolerate waste. Though born from revolution, he hated the mess it left behind. He wanted a France that was neat, predictable, and loyal. A state shaped not by idealism, but by structure. And so he began to build. He reformed the legal system, giving it the clarity and consistency it lacked. Across the country, judges ruled by different traditions. In some towns, old royal law lingered. In others, revolutionary decrees held sway. The result was confusion, uncertainty, and injustice. Napoleon called for a single code, clear, logical, and universal. It became known as the Code Civil, or more famously, the Napoleonic Code. It established equal treatment before the law, the right to own property, the authority of contracts, and the abolition of feudal privileges. It protected religious freedom and strengthened civil marriage. It also placed authority in the hands of men, limiting the rights of women and reinforcing the power of the father within the family. The code was not perfect, but it was orderly, and it lasted. In fact, many of its principles remain in place today, not just in France, but in countries across Europe and beyond. Alongside legal reform came economic repair. France's finances had suffered from war and mismanagement. Napoleon created the Bank of France, gave it authority to stabilize currency, and rebuilt public trust in the value of the franc. He balanced the budget. He imposed new taxes based on fairer systems of collection. No longer would tax collectors enrich themselves while the state starved. Napoleon's inspectors checked everything, and corruption was met with swift punishment. He also founded the Cour des Comptes, a state auditing office to watch over public spending. Nothing was left to chance. Education, too, was reshaped. Napoleon believed in schools, not just for learning, but for producing citizens who would serve the state. He created lycées, or secondary schools, under national control. Their goal was not only literacy, but discipline. Students studied science, mathematics, and history. They wore uniforms. They saluted their teachers. They learned obedience alongside knowledge. For higher education, he reestablished universities, especially in Paris, focused on producing administrators, engineers, and officers. He did not trust the church to guide the minds of youth. The future, he believed, should belong to the state. He also rewarded merit. Under Napoleon, talent rose, no matter where it came from. Soldiers from peasant families became generals. Sons of shopkeepers became magistrates. The old noble titles meant little unless accompanied by action. Napoleon himself had risen from obscurity. He expected others to prove themselves the same way. But behind these reforms lay a broader truth. Napoleon was preparing France not just for peace, but for power. He reorganized the military, ensuring loyalty at every level. Regiments were reshuffled, officers rotated, orders centralized. He introduced a system of conscription that gave him a steady stream of young men, trained and ready. He improved the roads, not only for trade, but to move armies faster. He built bridges and canals. He inspected everything personally when he could, memorizing maps and timelines, asking questions few dared to answer wrong. And all the while, beyond France's borders, the world stirred. The brief peace with Britain was breaking down. The Treaty of Amiens, signed in 1802, had always been fragile. Neither side trusted the other. Britain watched with concern as France expanded influence across the continent, taking Belgium, reshaping Switzerland, planting allies in Italy. Napoleon, in turn, watched Britain strengthen its navy and hesitate to withdraw from key territories. Soon, both sides accused the other of bad faith. By 1803, war resumed. But Napoleon no longer viewed this as merely a contest between states. He had begun to think bigger. In May of that year, he sold Louisiana, not just New Orleans, but an entire swath of North America, to the United States. The Louisiana Purchase, as it became known, gave America enormous land at a low price. To some, it seemed foolish. To Napoleon, it was strategic. He no longer had the navy to defend distant colonies. France needed money for war. Better to sell than to lose. And by strengthening the United States, he created a distant counterweight to Britain, a long-term threat to its empire. Europe, meanwhile, became a chessboard. Napoleon positioned troops along the coast of the English Channel. He began building a fleet in Boulogne, hoping to cross and invade. He reviewed troops daily. He spoke of England as a nation of shopkeepers and promised to humble them. But deep down, he knew the Channel was a moat he might never cross. The British Navy was strong, too strong. Still, the buildup served a purpose. It kept British attention fixed, while Napoleon moved elsewhere. In 1804, a new chapter began. There was talk, first in whispers, then in public, of empire. The Republic, in name, still stood, but few believed in it anymore. The assemblies held sessions, but passed what they were told. Elections were managed. Power had narrowed until it flowed from a single hand. And so a proposal was made. The people would vote. Should Napoleon Bonaparte become Emperor of the French? The answer came in a landslide. Yes. Some questioned the numbers. Others questioned the idea. But the decision was made. On December 2nd, 1804, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, Napoleon crowned himself emperor. The church was full, the air cold but electric. Pope Pius VII had traveled from Rome to bless the ceremony. Yet when the moment came, Napoleon took the crown from the altar and placed it on his own head. It was symbolic. He owed his crown to no one, not to the people, not to the Pope, not to history. He crowned Josephine, too, as empress. They stood before the altar, bathed in candlelight, dressed in silk and velvet. The music soared. The congregation watched in reverent silence. Outside, the streets of Paris were filled with onlookers. Cannons fired. Bells rang. Crowds cheered. But the mood was not the same as during the Revolution. It was not the joy of liberation. It was the hush of awe. France had come full circle, from monarchy to republic to empire. And Napoleon stood at the center. He was not Louis. He was not Robespierre. He was something new. A man who had risen by merit, ruled by force, and cloaked it all in law. In the following months, he moved to secure the dynasty. He created nobility, not by birth, but by service. Marshals, ministers, and loyal officials were granted titles, duke, prince, count. Their coats of arms were not ancient, but recently designed symbols of a new elite. He built monuments, the Arc de Triomphe, the Vendôme Column, public fountains and bridges, not just for beauty, but for memory. He wanted Paris to reflect his image, to echo his reign in stone. He planned military campaigns with the same care. Austria, Russia, and Britain had now joined forces again. The Third Coalition was forming. Napoleon knew what was coming. He moved fast. By 1805, he had assembled the Grande Armée, a force unlike any other in Europe. Well-trained, well-fed, loyal. He marched them east, through forests, across rivers, into valleys. He watched weather patterns, studied supply lines, moved with eerie precision. In October, the Austrians surrendered at Ulm, encircled and confused. Weeks later, Napoleon stood in the foggy plains of Austerlitz, facing both the Austrians and the Russians. It was December 2nd, the anniversary of his coronation. The sun broke through the mist just as battle began. Later, they would call it the Sun of Austerlitz. The victory was total. The coalition collapsed. Austria sued for peace. Napoleon returned to Paris in triumph, the people once again cheering, the empire stronger than ever. He was no longer simply a general or a consul or even a new kind of monarch. He was France. Chapter 7, Emperor of the French. The year was 1806, and Europe was no longer the same. On maps across the continent, borders had shifted like sand in the wind. Kingdoms had fallen. New states had emerged. Old powers looked over their shoulders. In every capital, eyes turned toward Paris. They did not look for kings or parliaments. They watched one man, Emperor Napoleon I. He had taken the crown not from birthright, but from movement. He rose through smoke and gunfire, through ballots and proclamations, until he stood alone at the center of power. Where once France had argued over its soul, now it followed a single voice. And yet the man himself remained a contradiction. Napoleon governed with order, but marched with fire. He admired Rome, yet moved faster than any Roman general. He quoted philosophers and poets, but dismissed ideas that stood in his way. He claimed to defend the revolution, even as he built an empire. He crowned himself emperor, then declared that the crown was merely the symbol of the people's will. He was France, in all its glory, confusion, and ambition. By 1806, the Grande Army was the most disciplined and effective military force in Europe. Over 200,000 men, organized into corps that could move and fight independently, each with infantry, cavalry, artillery, and supplies. No other army matched their mobility. No other general matched their vision. Napoleon knew how to feed and clothe his troops on long marches. He knew how to lift their spirits with short speeches, promises of glory, and carefully staged honors. He made medals mean something. He remembered names. He rode among the men without ceremony, asking questions, testing morale. To the soldiers, he was not just their commander. He was the reason they followed the tricolor into foreign lands. Yet as France grew stronger, her enemies gathered. The Third Coalition, broken at Austerlitz, was replaced by a new alliance. Prussia, once hesitant, now joined Britain and Russia in preparing for war. They believed Napoleon had gone too far. They hoped to stop him before his power became permanent. In autumn of 1806, Napoleon struck first. He led the Grande Army north into Prussian territory, moving quickly, dividing his forces just enough to confuse the enemy, but never too far to reinforce. His scouts rode ahead, locating enemy positions. His staff worked day and night to coordinate maps, messages, and routes. On October 14th, near the twin towns of Jena and Auerstedt, the French clashed with the Prussians. At Jena, Napoleon himself commanded. His troops engaged under fog and mist. Cannon roared through the morning. The Prussians, rigid and slow, found themselves overwhelmed by faster, more flexible French divisions. By midday, their line crumbled. At Auerstedt, just a few miles away, Marshal Davout, with fewer troops, faced a much larger Prussian force. But Davout held firm. His men fought with precision. They pushed back again and again. By nightfall, the Prussians were in retreat. 2 battles, 2 victories. In a single day, Prussia's army collapsed. Napoleon marched into Berlin shortly after. The city, proud and orderly, opened its gates. Citizens watched in silence as French troops filled the squares. Statues were draped. Flags changed. Orders were posted. Napoleon visited the tomb of Frederick the Great, the legendary Prussian king. He stood quietly beside it and turned to his officers. "If he were alive," Napoleon said, "we would not be here today." From Berlin, he issued the Berlin Decrees, launching the Continental System, an attempt to choke Britain economically by cutting off its trade with the continent. All European ports under French influence were to refuse British ships and goods. It was bold and risky. Britain still ruled the seas. Napoleon ruled the land. Each hoped to starve the other into surrender. But commerce, like water, finds its way. Smugglers thrived. Merchants found secret paths. The continental system hurt France almost as much as Britain. Still, Napoleon pushed forward. He turned east toward Poland, where Russian forces now gathered. The winter of 1806-07 was bitter and long. Snow covered the roads. Rivers froze. But the Grande Armée kept moving. Villages became barracks. Churches became hospitals. Roads turned to mud. Horses collapsed. Men slept in frost, woke stiff, and kept marching. In February 1807, near the village of Elo, French and Russian forces met. The Battle of Elo was one of the most brutal of Napoleon's career. It lasted 2 days. Snow and blood mixed on the ground. Bodies froze where they fell. Musket fire cracked through white haze. Cannon fire echoed for miles. At one point, the Russian army began to push back. Napoleon, desperate to hold, ordered a massive cavalry charge. Thousands of horsemen thundering through the blizzard, sabers raised, uniforms drenched in red and ice. The battle ended without clear victory. Thousands died. Both sides claimed success. Napoleon, though shaken, continued to advance. In June, near the town of Friedland, he met the Russians again. This time, he crushed them. The Russian retreat was chaotic. Bridges collapsed. Artillery was abandoned. Napoleon stood atop a ridge and watched as his enemies fell back across the rivers, exhausted and broken. Tsar Alexander I, young and uncertain, agreed to negotiate. In July 1807, Napoleon and the Tsar met on a raft in the Niemen River near the town of Tilsit. The scene was symbolic. Two emperors on neutral waters, far from capitals, deciding the fate of Europe. They spoke in private. They laughed. They shook hands. A treaty was signed. Russia would withdraw. Prussia would lose territory. New kingdoms would be created under French influence. Napoleon, now at the peak of his power, redrew Europe again. He created the Kingdom of Westphalia, placing his brother Jerome on the throne. In Italy, he named relatives and loyal generals as kings, viceroys, and governors. The Duchy of Warsaw was established for Polish allies. In Holland, his brother Louis became king. His family became a royal web. Sons and brothers, sisters and cousins, all placed carefully across the continent, like pieces on a chessboard. But power brought new problems. His wife, Josephine, could not bear him a child. Though their love had cooled, she remained empress. Still, the lack of an heir haunted him. If he died, who would inherit the empire? His ministers whispered. His family pressured. He began to consider divorce, not out of passion, but policy. Josephine knew. She cried in private, pleaded in public. But she understood. In 1809, after another brief war with Austria, a conflict Napoleon won at the Battle of Wagram, he made his choice. He divorced Josephine. It was a quiet ceremony. No public drama. She left the palace with dignity, still loved but no longer empress. Following year, Napoleon married Marie Louise of Austria, the teenage daughter of the Emperor of Austria. It was a union of politics, not affection. But it brought legitimacy. The Habsburgs were ancient royalty. Their daughter now became part of the Bonaparte dynasty. In 1811, a child was born. Napoleon Francois Joseph Charles Bonaparte, the King of Rome. France celebrated for days. Cannons fired. Bells rang. Napoleon had his heir. He believed now that his empire would last beyond him, that his name would echo not just through battles, but through blood. But shadows began to gather. Spain, invaded in 1808, refused to bend. What Napoleon thought would be a quick campaign turned into a nightmare. Spanish guerrillas ambushed French patrols. British troops, under Wellington, arrived to support the resistance. The Peninsular War dragged on for years, draining men and money. At the same time, the continental system began to crack. Russia, unhappy with the economic burden, hinted at withdrawal. Napoleon watched closely. His alliance with the Tsar began to crumble. Yet still, he believed in his strength. He had reshaped France. He had written law. He had crowned kings. He had fought empires and won. But now, as he looked east toward Russia, he saw the one great challenge left. A land vast and cold. An army untested in defeat. A Tsar who once smiled, now silent. And so, he began to plan again. The Emperor of the French, crowned by his own hand, would soon march to the edge of the world. Chapter 8. The Russian Campaign begins. By the spring of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, stood at the helm of the largest army Europe had ever seen. His empire stretched from the shores of Portugal to the banks of the Elbe. He ruled directly over France, Italy, and the Netherlands, and indirectly through client kings and loyal relatives over much of the continent. Statues of his likeness dotted city squares. His laws, stamped with the imperial seal, governed millions of lives. His victories were studied in military academies, and his name was known at every house and village, sometimes spoken with reverence, sometimes with fear. But the world he had shaped no longer fit easily within his grasp. The war in Spain had become a wound that refused to heal. The British, entrenched in Portugal and aided by local partisans, resisted every push. The continental system, meant to isolate Britain economically, was unraveling as trade seeped through smuggler routes and corrupt ports. And to the east, his most delicate alliance was beginning to crumble. Russia, vast and distant, had once bowed to Napoleon after the Treaty of Tilsit, but peace had grown cold. Tsar Alexander I had begun reopening ports to British ships, citing hardship among his people and merchants. Napoleon saw it not as policy, but as betrayal. He believed in alliances made through strength. When that strength was questioned, his answer was always the same: movement. So he began to prepare. He called it the Second Polish War, framing it as a campaign of necessity. He summoned troops from every corner of his empire: Frenchmen, Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutch, even reluctant Spaniards and Croats. Over 600,000 men were assembled. Some came for duty, others for pay, and many for glory. They would cross rivers, forests, and steppes in service of a man they had never met, a man who had defeated Austria, humbled Prussia, and shaken the Pope's hand. Napoleon called it the Grande Armée. But it was no longer just French. It was European, built from dozens of languages and customs, a patchwork sewn together by fear, loyalty, and command. The logistics were staggering. Thousands of wagons were readied. Horses were purchased and branded. Mountains of supplies, uniforms, muskets, tents, flour, boots, powder, salt were packed and moved east. Roads were repaired. Bridges were reinforced. Maps were drawn and redrawn. He calculated distances by the hour, marked rivers by their crossing points, and charted towns for their water and fodder. He set up supply depots all along the way, trusting that each would hold, that no wheel would break, that no soldier would falter. And yet, deep down, he knew the truth. Russia was not Austria. It was not Prussia. It was not Italy. It was wide. It was slow. It did not break. It bent. Still, he pressed forward. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon crossed the Niemen River, which marked the border of Russian territory. He stood on the far bank and watched his army flow behind him, cavalry stirring dust, cannon creaking over wooden bridges, columns of infantry stretching to the horizon. He wore his simple uniform, gray coat, bicorn hat, plain boots. He rode a small horse and said little, but in his presence, order held. The men cheered as they marched. The drums rolled. Flags waved in the morning light. Napoleon expected a grand battle early on, a set-piece fight where he could outmaneuver the Russian generals and deliver a crushing blow, as he had done so many times before. But the enemy refused to meet him directly. The Russians retreated. Each time the French advanced, the Russians pulled back, burning fields and villages as they went. The earth was scorched. The air filled with smoke. Wells were poisoned. Food vanished. Bridges were destroyed. The very land seemed to rise against the invaders. Napoleon's army, built for battles, now marched through emptiness. And then came the heat. The Russian summer that year was unusually hot. Days stretched on with oppressive warmth. Dust clung to faces and uniforms. Water became scarce. Horses died by the thousands. Men collapsed beside the road, unable to rise. Disease crept into the ranks, dysentery, fever, infection. Still, they moved on. Napoleon occupied Vilnius, but found it hollow. The enemy had vanished again. He issued proclamations of progress, assuring France that all was under control. He met with local nobles, seeking allies. But the march continued. In Smolensk, the Russians finally made a stand, a rearguard defense. The French assaulted the city, house by house, room by room. The streets ran with blood. Cannonballs tore through ancient walls. Fires raged. When it was over, the Russians retreated again. Napoleon entered the city and found little. The churches stood silent. The granaries were empty. Another ghost. The Grande Armée was shrinking. Men died daily from exhaustion, sickness, starvation. Horses lay in piles beside the road. Wagons were abandoned. Uniforms were torn. Boots worn through. Units that had begun the march with 10,000 now counted 3. Discipline weakened. Soldiers strayed in search of food. Looting became routine. Murders followed. Napoleon kept moving forward. To pause was to admit failure, and so he pushed toward Moscow, the heart of Russia. He believed, or perhaps needed to believe, that once Moscow fell, the Tsar would negotiate. That this distant empire, slow and silent, would at last come to the table. In early September, near the village of Borodino, the Russians finally stood to fight. The battlefield was wide, lined with ridges and trenches. The Russians had dug in, creating redoubts and earthworks. Their army stretched across the horizon, strong, silent, waiting. On September 7th, 1812, the two forces clashed. The Battle of Borodino was the bloodiest single day of Napoleon's career. From dawn until dusk, men fought tooth and nail. French infantry advanced under musket fire, storming redoubts, only to be driven back. Artillery thundered. Cavalry charged and fell. Entire regiments disappeared in hours. Napoleon watched from a ridge, issuing orders, sending reserves, calculating. He never committed his imperial guard, his best troops. He feared needing them later. By nightfall, the Russians withdrew. The field belonged to Napoleon, but it was a hollow victory. Over 70,000 men had fallen in one day. The ground was covered with corpses, weapons, and shattered wood. Smoke lingered. Horses screamed in the distance. Napoleon did not pursue. He was tired. His army was tired. Moscow lay ahead. 8 days later, on September 14th, the French entered the city, but the gates did not open and surrender. Moscow was empty. Its citizens had fled. And then, as night fell, fires broke out. At first, just a few, then many. The sky turned red. Flames leapt from rooftop to rooftop. Churches, markets, palaces, all burned. The fires raged for 4 days. Moscow, the ancient capital, was destroyed by its own people. Napoleon moved into the Kremlin, the old fortress in the city's heart. He set up his quarters in rooms built for czars. He waited and waited. He wrote to Alexander I proposing peace. He sent messengers. He appealed to diplomacy. There was no answer. The silence became unbearable. The food supply dwindled. Winter approached, and on October 19, 1812, after more than a month in a city of ash and silence, Napoleon made the hardest decision of his life. He ordered a retreat. The Grande Armée turned west, back toward the Niemen River, the same path they had come, now lined with ghosts. And as they marched, winter began. Chapter 9. The Long Retreat. The morning of October 19, 1812, broke cold and gray over the scorched rooftops of Moscow. The wind moved through the hollowed streets like a whisper. Snow had not yet fallen, but the air carried its promise. The skies above the ruined city were low and sullen, as if mourning the emptiness below. Inside the walls of the Kremlin, Napoleon Bonaparte stood in silence. He had delayed for weeks. He had written letters, sent envoys, and waited for an answer that never came. He believed, perhaps until the last moment, that Tsar Alexander I would offer terms that the fall of Moscow, even in flames, would be enough to bring Russia to the negotiating table. But Moscow had not yielded. The Tsar had not replied. And now the cold was settling in. The fields beyond the city had been stripped. No food remained. The foraging parties returned with empty carts. Horses died by the hundreds, and the men, already thin and ragged from the summer's march, began to speak more openly of hunger. There was no more reason to stay. Napoleon gave the order. The Grande Armée, what remained of it, began to move west. More than 400,000 had crossed the Niemen River in June. By October, fewer than half remained. Disease, desertion, combat, and starvation had already taken their toll. Now they turned back, marching along the same roads that had once carried them east in triumph. But the land they had once passed through was not the same. Where there had been grain fields, there was now frost. Where villages had offered shelter, there were ashes. The Russian army had followed them at a distance, never too close, never too far. Cossack riders shadowed the retreat, striking like wolves, fast, sudden, then gone again. The first snow fell in early November. At first it was light, a soft layer of white covering the burned-out churches and frozen fields. But soon it thickened. The temperature dropped below freezing. Winds howled through the trees. The roads turned to ice. Horses slipped and broke their legs. Wagons shattered on frozen ruts. Soldiers fell behind and did not rise. Boots tore at the seams. Blankets froze stiff. Rations, already meager, became impossible to cook or chew. Frostbite set in. Fingers blackened. Toes curled and died. Men wrapped themselves in whatever scraps they could find. curtains, saddlecloths, even straw. The uniforms of the Grande Armée, once fine and proud, were now stained and threadbare, and yet they marched, hour after hour, day after day, one foot in front of the other, heads down, eyes hollow. There was no destination, only the West, only the memory of France. Napoleon rode near the front, wrapped in a thick cloak, his face still calm, still calculating. He gave orders as best he could, tried to maintain discipline. He formed rear guards to protect the stragglers. He reorganized the columns. He tried, even in ruin, to hold the army together. But nature did not negotiate. Blizzards rolled across the open plains. Visibility vanished. Entire units wandered off the road and were never seen again. Rivers, once low and lazy, now surged with ice. The Berezina loomed ahead. The Battle of the Berezina came in late November. The river was half frozen, wide and deep. The Russians had moved ahead and blocked the main crossing. Napoleon's engineers, under constant attack, built makeshift bridges from scraps of wood and rope. The army tried to cross. Chaos followed. Thousands crowded the riverbanks. Cannon fire rained down. Bridges collapsed under weight. Horses plunged into the water and vanished. Men fell and were crushed. Others leapt into the river to escape flames, only to drown beneath the ice. By the time the crossing ended, tens of thousands were dead. Yet somehow, Napoleon survived. He crossed with his staff, his remaining guard close behind. He looked back and saw what had once been the greatest army in Europe, now broken, scattered, limping into the snow. And still he moved forward. He knew what awaited him in Paris: fear, questions, possibly revolt. But he also knew how to shape narrative. He would return not defeated, but as a leader who had braved the storm. He would speak not of loss, but of sacrifice. Before leaving Russia entirely, he ordered the army to continue retreating toward Vilnius. He left command in the hands of his trusted marshals, Murat, Ney, and Berthier, and then slipped away quietly with a small escort. He raced back toward France in a sleigh, traveling day and night, across frozen roads and hostile villages. He disguised his movements, switched horses constantly, and pushed through storms. He passed through Germany, where allies smiled politely but watched carefully. By December, he was back in Paris. He had left with hundreds of thousands behind him. He returned alone, but he arrived before the news. Paris still knew little. Rumors had spread, of battles, of snow, of sickness, but not of collapse. Not yet. Napoleon entered the Tuileries Palace as he always had, without fanfare, without expression. He met with ministers, reviewed reports, and issued orders. To the public, he presented calm. To his staff, he was tireless. He gave speeches about rebuilding. He promised new armies, fresh conscripts. He spoke of spring campaigns and new alliances. He said nothing of the bodies left behind in the snow. He began to call the disaster a mortal wound from which the army would recover. But in his heart, he knew something had changed. The myth had cracked. Europe now understood that the emperor could bleed. The retreat from Russia was not just a military failure, it was a human catastrophe. Of the original 600,000 who had marched east, fewer than 100,000 returned. The roads were lined with graves. Entire regiments had vanished. Officers who had once dined on silver now chewed leather for warmth. And across the continent, old enemies stirred. Prussia, humiliated at Jena, began to arm again. Austria, uneasy in alliance, began to hesitate. Britain, never conquered, increased support for Spain and Portugal. Napoleon, ever the strategist, understood that time was now his enemy. He had to rebuild quickly. He ordered new conscriptions, the class of 1813. Boys of 17 were called up. Weapons were issued. Drills began in towns and cities. Veterans from older wars were recalled. Blacksmiths hammered out bayonets and cannon wheels. Uniforms were stitched by candlelight. The empire began to hum again, but it was thinner, more desperate. Napoleon met with ambassadors. He reminded allies of their oaths. He punished defectors. He bribed princes. He shifted his focus from Spain to Germany, hoping to hold the center of Europe. But the mood had changed. The dream of invincibility was gone. People no longer whispered of the sun at Austerlitz. They spoke now of frost and hunger, of lost sons and broken wagons. Mothers wept. Wives prayed. Farmers counted the cost of silence. In the spring of 1813, the war resumed. Napoleon remarkably returned to the field. He still commanded with brilliance. He won battles at Lutzen, Bautzen, Dresden. His maps were still sharp. His instincts still precise. He moved his armies like chess pieces, pushing back coalitions of Austrians, Russians, and Prussians. But the cost was high. Each victory drained his reserves. Each battle ended with more friends buried. And his enemies no longer gave up. They regrouped, returned, pushed again. In October 1813, near the city of Leipzig, the final hammer fell. The Battle of Nations, as it came to be known, lasted 4 days. More than 500,000 men fought, the largest battle in European history until the 20th century. Napoleon was outnumbered. His troops fought bravely, holding lines, counterattacking, defending bridges. But the Allies pressed from all sides. Prussian volleys, Russian cannon, Austrian cavalry, all crashed against his positions. On the 4th day, the French began to withdraw, but the bridges collapsed behind them. Thousands were trapped. Thousands died. Napoleon escaped, barely. He returned to France again, not as a conqueror, but as a shadow of one. And in the quiet winter that followed, as snow began to fall once more, the people of France looked toward the east and wondered if this time the road might not lead home again. Chapter 10. The Collapse of the Empire. The winter of 1813 to 1814 settled over France like a heavy blanket. The wind was sharp, the skies low and gray, and the air carried a stillness that did not speak of peace. In towns and villages, people walked quietly past shuttered shops and frostbitten trees. Farmers kept their eyes on the horizon, watching for the glow of distant fires or the dust of marching boots. In Paris, the mood was uneasy. The empire, once strong and vast, had begun to bend, and it bent toward breaking. Napoleon had returned from the defeat at Leipzig with less than half of his army. He arrived tired, thinner than before, and more cautious. He still rode with dignity. He still spoke with command, but the confidence that once lit his gaze had dimmed. The loss in Germany was more than a battlefield setback. It shattered the image he had cultivated for years, that he could not lose, that no coalition could stand against him, that fortune always favored the eagle. The Grand Army, once mighty and feared, was no longer the same. New conscripts filled the ranks, boys just past childhood, hastily trained and poorly equipped. The veterans who had once steadied the lines at Austerlitz and Jena were mostly gone. The drums still beat, the colors still waved, but the soul of the army had changed. France itself had changed too. After years of war, the people were weary. Taxes had risen. Food had grown scarce. Roads were broken. Bridges lay in disrepair. Trade had dried up under the weight of blockade and embargo. Families grieved sons they would never see again. Fields once filled with wheat now held unmarked graves. And worse still, the war had come home. For years, Napoleon had fought his enemies beyond France's borders. His soldiers marched through Italy, Austria, Prussia, Spain, Russia. His battles had been fought in distant cities and foreign fields. But now, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, foreign armies were entering France. The coalition, a united force of Austrians, Russians, Prussians, Swedes, and other allies, crossed the Rhine River in early January 1814. They came not as guests or observers, but as invaders. They moved quickly, pressing into French territory from all sides. In the north, the Prussians advanced under Blücher, bold and relentless. From the east, the Austrians and Russians moved through Alsace and Lorraine. In the southeast, smaller forces approached through Switzerland and the Alps. Napoleon knew the danger. He did not retreat to Paris. He did not wait behind palace walls. Instead, he gathered what troops he could and took to the field. Though vastly outnumbered, he fought with brilliance. In January and February, he launched a campaign that would become one of the most impressive of his life. It was later called the 6 Days Campaign. With fewer than 40,000 men, Napoleon fought and won multiple battles in rapid succession: Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, and Vauchamps. He moved faster than his enemies could react, striking isolated columns, turning their strength against them. His victories were bold, swift, and clever, but they were not enough. Each win left him weaker. Each success cost men he could not replace, and the enemy kept coming. For every column Napoleon defeated, 3 more advanced. The coalition had learned from the past. They no longer allowed him to isolate and destroy single armies. They coordinated. They communicated. They pressed together like a tightening ring. In Paris, the government began to waver. Even some of Napoleon's oldest supporters, men who had served him for years, began to question his judgment. Ministers spoke in hushed tones. Generals made private plans. Some reached out to the coalition, offering quiet words of cooperation should the emperor fall. Napoleon heard the whispers. He tried to reassure his people. He issued proclamations. He promised new victories. He called on the French to rise in defense of the nation. He spoke of liberty, sovereignty, and pride. But the people were tired. They no longer rallied to the drum. In March 1814, the coalition reached the outskirts of Paris. Napoleon, still in the field, tried to maneuver north to relieve the city. He marched and countermarched. He fought at Arcis-sur-Aube, trying to draw the enemy away, but the city fell before he could reach it. On March 31st, Paris surrendered. Russian troops entered the capital. Their boots clattered on the cobbled streets. Their banners flew over city squares. Citizens stared in disbelief as foreign soldiers filled the boulevards. And with the fall of Paris, the empire broke. On April 2nd, the Senate declared Napoleon deposed. 2 days later, his marshals, once loyal, now defeated, approached him at Fontainebleau, where he had made his temporary headquarters. They begged him to abdicate. He resisted. He raged. He walked alone in the palace gardens, speaking to no one. But he knew there was no army left, no path to victory, no more time. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon signed the Act of Abdication. He gave up the throne of France. His empire, the laws he had written, the monuments he had built, the roads he had marched, all slipped from his hands. But not without condition. Under the terms negotiated with the coalition, Napoleon would not face execution or imprisonment. Instead, he would be exiled, not to a dungeon, but to a small island in the Mediterranean Sea. The island was called Elba. It lay off the coast of Tuscany, a speck on the map, known for fishing villages, quiet hills, and olive groves. He would be allowed to keep a small guard, a modest income, and the title of Emperor of Elba, a hollow gesture meant to preserve dignity. On April 20th, Napoleon said farewell to his imperial guard. In the courtyard of Fontainebleau, surrounded by the men who had followed him through fire and snow, he raised his hand in salute. His voice was steady. "Soldiers of my old guard," he said, "I bid you farewell." Some wept. Others stood motionless, eyes forward. He embraced their commander. And then, Without ceremony, he turned and walked away. He boarded a carriage, then a ship. And so the Emperor of the French, conqueror of nations, maker of kings, master of Europe, sailed into exile. On Elba, he tried to govern. He reformed local agriculture. He built roads. He reorganized the island's laws. He met with villagers, held court, even staged parades. But the island was small. The days passed slowly. He walked alone along the cliffs, watching ships on the horizon. He received news from France of King Louis XVIII, brother of the long-dead Louis XVI, now restored to the throne, of rising taxes, of discontent, of soldiers unpaid, of merchants angered, of citizens who remembered a time not so long ago when France had stood strong. And he listened. He listened carefully. He watched for signs. And as spring returned to Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte began to plan again. Because for all his defeats, all his losses, all his exile, he was not yet finished. Chapter 11. The 100 Days. The small island of Elba, resting in the warm waters of the Mediterranean, was meant to be a final chapter, a quiet ending for a man who had once commanded the fate of Europe. For most exiled rulers, it would have been enough. A soft bed, a title and name, a few local affairs to govern, a slow fading from public life. But Napoleon Bonaparte had never lived in stillness. Though he walked the cliffs and vineyards, though he reorganized the roads and laws of his tiny domain, his mind remained on France. The rhythms of Elba could not distract him for long. The air was gentle. The olive trees swayed, but the silence pressed too heavily. From the moment he stepped ashore in April 1814, he watched the mainland. Each ship that passed through the waters near the island brought letters, whispers, fragments of news. He gathered information like a merchant gathers coin, and the news slowly began to shift. The restored King Louis XVIII, installed in Napoleon's place, had returned to power with an uneasy hand. He promised to respect the achievements of the revolution, the Code Napoleon, civil rights, land reforms, but his ties to the old nobility created distance. Many of the military officers who had served Napoleon were cast aside. Pensions were revoked, honors stripped. Some were exiled, others retired early. The French people, weary of war, had hoped for calm. Instead, they found division. The economy worsened. Taxes increased. Food prices rose. In taverns, people began to speak openly again of the days when France had been feared, when roads were paved, when the borders were strong, and when a short man in a gray coat could change the course of history with a single order. Napoleon listened, and he waited. He knew France. He knew its moods, how quickly it could rise from resignation into passion. And in early 1815, when word reached him that the British planned to move him farther from Europe, perhaps to St. Helena, a windswept rock in the South Atlantic, he made his decision. He would not wait to be buried. He would return. On February 26, 1815, under the cover of night, Napoleon boarded a small brig named the Inconstant. He was accompanied by a few hundred men, loyal guards, soldiers who had followed him from Moscow to Leipzig. They had no great fleet, no powerful army, no nation behind them, only a name. They landed on the French coast at Gulf Yuan on March 1st. There were no battleships waiting, no parades, just a stretch of shoreline and the road north. From there began a march unlike any other. Napoleon did not hide. He did not sneak. He moved openly, speaking to peasants, garrison commanders, villagers. He offered no threats, no bribes, only a choice. "I am your emperor," he said, returned from exile. At first, he was ignored, then watched, then approached. Soldiers sent to arrest him instead knelt and cried, At Laffrey, an entire regiment blocked his path. Napoleon stepped forward alone, opened his coat, and said, "If any among you would shoot his emperor, let him do so now." No shots were fired. The soldiers joined him. So did the next unit, and the next. By the time he reached Grenoble, the town welcomed him. By the time he reached Lyon, he was no longer a returning exile. He was a force. King Louis XVIII, informed of the march and the defections, hesitated. He ordered troops south, but they too began to switch sides. Officers who had once sworn loyalty to the new monarchy remembered the medals on their chests, medals given by Napoleon. On March 20th, just 3 weeks after landing with no official support, Napoleon entered Paris. The king had fled the night before. There was no bloodshed, no revolution, no civil war. It was simply a reversal. The empire had returned, but not the same. Napoleon knew that France, exhausted by years of war, would not tolerate another long campaign. He moved quickly to reassure the public. He swore he would no longer seek conquest. He promised peace, reform, balance. He issued proclamations calling for unity. He reassembled a government, reappointed former ministers, and began rebuilding the army. He called this period the 100 Days. In truth, it would last just over 3 months, a fleeting moment when the empire was reborn, not by force, but by will. But across Europe, fear moved faster than reason. The Allied powers, Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, had gathered in Vienna, intending to redraw the map of Europe. When news of Napoleon's return reached them, they did not wait for his terms. They did not pause to see whether his promises held. On March 25th, they declared him an outlaw. War was immediate. Troops were mobilized. Armies marched. Napoleon, with only weeks to prepare, faced the full force of Europe once again. He acted with his usual speed. He assembled over 125,000 men, not the 500,000 of earlier years, but enough. Veterans returned. New recruits drilled day and night. Cannons were wheeled out of storage. Horses were purchased, saddled, and fitted. Uniforms were stitched, weapons cleaned, maps redrawn. Napoleon chose to strike first. He would not wait for the Allies to surround him. He would drive a wedge between them, attacking Belgium, where British and Prussian forces were gathering. If he could defeat them separately, he might force negotiations. In June 1815, he marched north. The countryside of Belgium, green and rolling, echoed with drumbeats and the low rumble of artillery wheels. Villagers peered from behind shutters. Farmers stood at the edge of fields and watched columns pass, unsure whether to wave or hide. On June 16th at Ligny, Napoleon defeated the Prussians under Blucher. It was a hard fight, intense, costly, but the Prussians withdrew. On the same day, at Quatre-Bras, Marshal Ney engaged the British under Wellington but failed to break them fully. The British held. 2 days later, the armies met again, near a small village called Waterloo. The name was unremarkable. A scattering of farms, hedges, and low hills. But what happened there would mark the end of an age. The morning of June 18th was damp. Rain had fallen through the night, turning the fields to mud. Cannons sank into the ground. Muskets misfired. The air smelled of wet soil and powder. Napoleon surveyed the British lines, stretched along a ridge, anchored by farms at either flank. He planned to break them, piece by piece. The battle began late in the morning. Cannon fire opened. Skirmishers advanced. The French pressed forward, attacking the flanks, testing the center. The farmhouse of Hougoumont became a fierce point of fighting, changing hands multiple times. Midday passed. Napoleon launched cavalry charges, hoping to shatter the line. But the British, trained and steady, formed squares and held. Round after round, they repelled the attacks. Then came the key moment. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite, his most trusted troops, Veterans of Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram were ordered to advance. They moved forward in silence, their boots pressed into the mud. Their bearskin hats swayed with each step. Muskets glinted beneath gray skies. They reached the British line, and for the first time, the guard broke. The cry went up. La Garde recule. The guard is retreating. Panic spread. Units began to collapse. Soldiers fled. Some threw down their weapons. Others surrendered. The road south, once filled with hope, now filled with men running for their lives. Napoleon tried to rally them. He rode among the fleeing troops, calling for order. But the line had broken. The battle was lost. He escaped with a small escort, riding through the night. The next day, he reached Charleroi, then moved south again. He still hoped for a chance to regroup, but news traveled fast. Paris had already learned of the defeat. The chambers of government, uncertain and cautious, moved swiftly. On June 22, 1815, just 4 days after Waterloo, Napoleon abdicated again. He offered the throne to his young son, Napoleon II, just 4 years old. But the Allies refused. They would accept no Bonaparte, no continuation. Napoleon was taken into custody. This time there would be no Elba. The British, determined to prevent another return, chose a place far beyond the reach of European shores. An island in the South Atlantic. A volcanic rock surrounded by thousands of miles of open ocean. St. Helena. And so, in late July, Napoleon boarded a British warship, HMS Bellerophon, bound for exile once more. He was 46 years old, and for the first time in his life, he knew that there would be no more campaigns, no more marches, no more victories. The 100 days had ended. Chapter 12. St. Helena. The island of St. Helena sits alone in the vastness of the South Atlantic, a speck of volcanic rock more than 1,000 miles from the nearest continent. Surrounded by deep water and rough surf, it offered no welcoming shore, no easy harbor. Steep cliffs rose from the sea, covered in scrub and wind-shaped trees. The sky above was often overcast, the weather shifting between drizzle and sunlight, wind and silence. It was here, in October of 1815, that Napoleon Bonaparte, former Emperor of the French, was brought ashore. He stepped from the small boat in silence, wearing a plain uniform and carrying nothing of great value. He was no longer the master of an empire. There were no parades, no flags, no soldiers waiting in formation. A small British garrison manned the island, led by officers charged with ensuring only one task, that he never left. The British, having witnessed his return from Elba, were taking no chances this time. St. Helena had no nearby allies, no neighbors to stir trouble, no sympathetic ports, just rough cliffs, long roads, and guards at every turn. Napoleon was placed under supervision at a modest home near the coast, while preparations were made to convert Longwood House, a damp estate in the island's interior, into a permanent residence. The work was slow. Supplies were limited. For weeks, he waited in temporary lodgings, pacing, reading, and walking alone along the ridges. Longwood, when he finally moved in, was far from luxurious. The roof leaked. The walls sweated with moisture. Winds howled across the plains. Mold crept into corners. The house, built for a governor's assistant, had never been intended for long-term habitation, especially not for an emperor, and yet it became his final home. The British assigned Sir Hudson Lowe as the island's governor, responsible for overseeing Napoleon's confinement. The two men met early on and never warmed to each other. Lowe was strict, formal, and suspicious. Napoleon was proud, aloof, and unforgiving of insult. Each saw in the other a figure to be resisted. Their relationship, strained from the beginning, deteriorated further over the years. Napoleon was allowed to walk within designated areas, but always under observation. Letters were censored. Visitors were restricted. Any departure from protocol required approval. Napoleon refused to refer to himself as General Bonaparte, the title Britain insisted upon. He considered it an insult to his past and his dignity. And so, a quiet war unfolded. Not with armies, but with letters, delays, regulations, and stares. Napoleon surrounded himself with a small group of loyal companions. Among them were Count Bertrand, General Montholon, and General Gourgaud, as well as a handful of servants and aides. His longtime valet, Marchand, remained by his side. They dined together each evening. Meals were simple. Wine was rationed. Bread was often stale. Napoleon, once accustomed to the grand kitchens of the Tuileries, now ate boiled meats and weak soup. But he maintained formality. He dressed properly, spoke with precision, and carried himself as if still among ministers and marshals. He established a routine. Each morning, he rose at a fixed hour, bathed, dressed, and reviewed correspondence. He read constantly: history, philosophy, geography. Books were delivered from Europe, though often delayed. He wrote notes in the margins, debated ideas aloud, and copied passages he admired. In the afternoon, he walked the grounds when weather allowed. He moved slowly, hands behind his back, head slightly bowed. His mind wandered far from the island, to Egypt, to Austerlitz, to the corridors of power in Paris. On clear days, he would stop along the ridge and gaze out at the sea, watching the endless motion of waves that led nowhere. As months passed, his health began to decline. The damp air of Longwood, the limited diet, and the stress of confinement wore on him. He developed stomach pains, fatigue, and recurring fevers. His skin lost its color. His posture, once commanding, began to sag. Doctors were called, but treatments were rudimentary. Bleedings, tonics, rest. Napoleon, ever skeptical of physicians, tolerated their presence, but trusted his own instincts more. Despite his condition, he remained mentally sharp. He dictated memoirs, long reflections on his campaigns, his policies, his beliefs. He spoke at length to his companions, analyzing the rise and fall of empires, the nature of power, the failures of diplomacy. He sought to shape how he would be remembered, not as a tyrant or warmonger, but as a builder, a modernizer, a man of vision. He defended his decisions, the concordat with the church, the Napoleonic Code, the organization of the state. He regretted some campaigns, particularly Spain and Russia, but insisted that his intentions had always been for the strength and stability of France. His words were written down, edited, and later smuggled off the island. They would form the basis of his legacy, a narrative crafted not by historians but by the man himself. He thought often of his son, the King of Rome, who had remained in Austria under the care of the Habsburgs. He wondered if the boy would grow up hearing stories of conquest or of exile. Letters to the child were written, but rarely answered. He thought also of Josephine, who had died in 1814, shortly after his first abdication. He kept a lock of her hair in a small locket beside his bed. Time passed slowly. Seasons changed, but the days remained the same. In 1817, his condition worsened. He complained of sharp abdominal pain, loss of appetite, and persistent nausea. His weight dropped. He found walking difficult. He spent more time indoors, seated near the window, wrapped in shawls. By 1819, he rarely left Longwood. The house, aging and worn, became quieter with each passing week. His companions continued their duties, but their conversations grew shorter. The emperor, once full of energy and motion, now slept for hours, waking confused and weak. Still, he remained aware of his surroundings. He reviewed maps. He dictated a few final notes. He asked to be buried on the banks of the Seine, among the French people I loved so much. On May 5, 1821, as a storm gathered over the island, Napoleon slipped into unconsciousness. He died in the early afternoon. There were no trumpets, no cannon salute, no final speech. Just rain on the roof, whined through the trees, and the steady breath of a dying man fading into silence. He was 51 years old. His body was prepared by his aides. A simple casket was built. The British offered honors, but insisted that his grave remain on the island. After some debate, he was buried in the Valley of the Willows, beneath a cluster of trees, with no name on the stone, only the word Napoleon. Years later, in 1840, the French government under King Louis-Philippe requested the return of his remains. The British agreed. His body was exhumed, placed in a grand sarcophagus, and returned to Paris. Crowds lined the river as his coffin passed. Veterans wept. Old flags were raised. On December 15, 1840, his remains were interred at Les Invalides, in a magnificent tomb beneath a dome of gold. He was placed at rest among the marble columns and eternal torches, surrounded by the nation he had once ruled. And so the man who had once ruled an empire, who had crowned himself in Notre Dame, who had stood atop snow-covered battlefields and thundered across Europe, came home at last in silence. His story did not end with his death. Books would be written, monuments built. Debates would continue. Was he a tyrant or a reformer? A liberator or a conqueror? But none could deny his impact. For better or worse, Napoleon Bonaparte had changed the course of history. And on a lonely island, far from all he had built, he had found the one thing he had never sought: stillness. Chapter 13. The Legacy of Napoleon. Long after the cannons fell silent, long after the tricolor ceased flying over foreign capitals, and long after the man himself was laid to rest, the legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte remained. It stretched beyond battlefields, beyond treaties, beyond borders redrawn in ink. It lived in the pages of law books, in the shape of nations, in the rhythm of governance that echoed far beyond the streets of Paris. The name Napoleon had become more than a title. It became an argument, a symbol, and in some cases, a myth. For many, he was a genius, a leader who rose from obscurity to change the world, a reformer who brought structure where there had been confusion, a man who, through will and intellect alone, shaped the fate of a continent. For others, he was a tyrant, a warmonger whose ambition led to millions of deaths, a ruler who crowned himself, silenced opposition, and placed power above principle. The truth, as always, sat somewhere between. He had been a student of the Enlightenment and the sword. He believed in equality before the law, but concentrated authority in his own hands. He championed education, infrastructure, and justice, even as he crushed dissent and censored the press. He emerged from the ashes of the French Revolution, claiming to defend its ideals. And in many ways, he did. He codified its reforms, protected its core liberties, and institutionalized its values. But he also brought back hierarchy. He rebuilt a nobility. He revived imperial symbolism, wrapped in Roman glory and French pride. To understand his legacy, one must look beyond crowns and campaigns. Napoleon left behind a blueprint, not only for how to seize power, but how to structure it. At the heart of this blueprint was the Napoleonic Code, completed in 1804. It became the foundation of modern civil law in France and later influenced legal systems across Europe, Latin America, the Middle East, and even parts of Asia. The code rejected feudal privileges. It established that all male citizens were equal before the law. It protected property rights and civil contracts. It emphasized clarity and uniformity. Laws could no longer vary by region or class. The state, rather than the church or aristocracy, became the source of authority. Yet it also reflected the values of its time, granting more legal power to husbands and fathers, limiting the rights of women, and reinforcing traditional family structures. Still, it brought order. and order was something that much of post-revolutionary France had lacked. His influence on education was similarly enduring. Napoleon expanded the lay system, state-run secondary schools designed to prepare boys for service to the nation. These schools promoted science, mathematics, language, and history, but also discipline and loyalty. He saw education not merely as a path to knowledge, but as a pillar of national strength. He founded institutions like the University of France, a centralized body overseeing education. He emphasized merit. Students and teachers alike were to be evaluated by performance, not ancestry. These reforms outlasted his reign. They shaped a generation of administrators, officers, engineers, and civil servants, and the idea that the state could and should direct education became a lasting principle in many countries. He also changed how nations viewed citizenship. Under his rule, being French meant more than birthright. It meant participation. Men were called to serve, to vote in plebiscites, to act as citizens of a state with defined rules and shared identity. While far from democratic by modern standards, Napoleon's system helped develop the idea of a centralized nation-state where the government played an active role in the lives of its people. That model spread. Napoleon's administrative structure, with prefects managing departments, centralized tax collection, national codes, and a uniform police force, became a model not only in France but in lands he once conquered. Even after the empire fell, many of these institutions remained in place, adopted by those who once opposed him. And in doing so, his enemies preserved part of his legacy. Militarily, his innovations reshaped warfare. He reorganized the army into corps, each capable of independent action but still coordinated as a whole. This gave him flexibility, allowing rapid movement and complex maneuvers. He emphasized speed, surprise, and the concentration of force at decisive points. His ability to read terrain, anticipate enemy plans, and inspire loyalty turned his campaigns into case studies. Military academies, even in countries that had fought against him, studied his battles, Austerlitz, Ulm, Jena, and others, as examples of tactical brilliance. The modern art of warfare owes much to the lessons drawn from Napoleon's victories and his defeats. Yet it was not only generals and ministers who remembered him. Across France, and even in parts of Europe, the memory of Napoleon lived in ordinary people. For some, it was nostalgia. For others, pride. A sense that once they had belonged to something larger, a France that led the world, not just through power, but through vision. Songs were sung, stories told, portraits hung in parlors and workshops. Children bore names like Napoleon, Josephine, Eugene. And in the decades that followed his death, something curious began to happen. The man who had been exiled, denounced, and buried thousands of miles from home became the subject of poems, paintings, and statues. His likeness returned to public squares. His life was romanticized, not just as a tale of conquest, but as a drama of rise and fall, brilliance and exile, genius and solitude. Victor Hugo, Chateaubriand, and other writers turned his story into legend. Artists painted him crossing the Alps on a rearing horse, his cloak flying in the wind. Never mind that he had actually crossed on a mule in the cold. By the mid-19th century, Napoleon had become not just a historical figure, but a symbol of destiny. And then came his nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who used that legacy to claim power for himself. In 1848, he was elected president of the Second French Republic. 4 years later, he staged a coup, declared himself Emperor Napoleon III, and founded the Second Empire. His rule, while different in tone, carried echoes of the first: centralized authority, grand projects, national pride. The Bonaparte name had returned. Even in the 20th and 21st centuries, the legacy of Napoleon continued to stir debate. Some admired his modernization. Others condemned his imperialism. But no one doubted his impact. He had touched everything: law, government, education, warfare, identity. And beyond all that, he had changed how individuals viewed the arc of history. He showed that one man, through ambition, intellect, and sheer force of will, could shape nations, command millions, and define an era. Of course, he had also shown that such power comes at great cost. His wars had killed over 3 million people. Towns were burned, fields ruined, families broken. His rise had brought pride, but his fall brought suffering. France, after his final defeat, was smaller, poorer, and more isolated than before. And yet, many still looked back, not with bitterness, but with awe. Perhaps because Napoleon embodied something rare, the tension between brilliance and danger, between reform and control, between vision and vanity. He had been born on a small island. He died on a smaller one. But in between, he moved like fire through the map of Europe. Today, his tomb rests beneath the great dome of Les Invalides in Paris. Visitors walk slowly along the marble corridor, circling the red granite sarcophagus. They pause. They look down. Some whisper. Some are silent. Others stand for long minutes, hands clasped behind their backs, staring at the place where ambition now sleeps. On the walls are carved the names of his greatest victories: Marengo, Austerlitz, Wagram, Friedland, and others. The echoes of his life remain, not in the sound of marching boots, but in the quiet of archives, the shape of nations, the system still in place 2 centuries later. His legacy, like his name, endures. And the question that has followed him since he first marched on Paris continues to be asked. Was Napoleon a man of his time, or did he in some way create the time that followed? Chapter 14. Reflections on Power. Power once gained does not sit quietly. It moves. It breathes. It grows and contracts. It tempts and isolates. For Napoleon Bonaparte, power had once been the very air he breathed, constant, necessary, and absolute. It had followed him from the rocky hills of Corsica to the heart of Paris, from the windswept plains of Italy to the freezing rivers of Russia. But with the passing of time, and especially in exile, power became something distant, not only absent, but transformed into a subject of contemplation. He had known what it felt like to give orders that shaped nations, to sign treaties that changed borders, to see his image cast in stone. But in his final years, he was left with something he had never truly had while in command: the time to think, without interruption, about what it had all meant. Power, he realized, was not simply the ability to act. It was a force that could both elevate and consume. His rise had been swift, but it had not been reckless. Each step had been grounded in timing, in calculation, in response to chaos. The French Revolution, for all its declarations and slogans, had left a power vacuum. The monarchy had fallen. The old nobility had scattered. The republic had no clear shape. And into that void stepped a young general, with confidence drawn, not from titles, but from victory. In those early days, power had been a tool, something to stabilize France, to organize its armies, to restore order. He spoke the language of reformers and moved with the precision of a strategist. The people, desperate for direction, welcomed him. But as victories mounted, the relationship changed. Power became more than a tool. It became a presence. At first, it had brought efficiency. Ministries reformed, roads repaired, laws codified. But soon, it asked for more. It asked for silence where there had once been debate. It asked for loyalty without question. And it rewarded only those who obeyed. The transformation had not been sudden. There had been no single moment where Napoleon crossed a line from servant of the state to master of it. It was a gradual layering, one decree, one office, one plebiscite at a time. By the time the crown rested on his head, the shift was complete. He had become emperor, not by inheritance, but by consolidation. He told himself it was necessary, that only strong leadership could protect France from foreign enemies and domestic unrest, that he was not creating tyranny, but shielding the gains of the revolution from reactionaries and royals alike. And perhaps in part that was true. But power, unchecked, has a way of distorting even noble intentions. He began to see himself not only as a ruler of men, but as the embodiment of a cause. France was no longer a nation, it was an extension of his will. Successes became confirmations of destiny. Failures were blamed on others. Counsel was accepted only when it echoed his own thinking. This change was subtle at first. In the early years of his reign, Napoleon maintained a network of advisors, ministers, and marshals. He listened. He asked questions. He considered options. But as time passed and his authority expanded, those around him learned to agree more than advise. Dissent became rare. Suggestions softened. Critiques vanished. The circle of influence narrowed. And so power, instead of being shared, became concentrated. It hardened into something brittle, resistant to change, blind to warning signs. Now, in reflection, Napoleon could see the cost, not only in lives lost or cities burned, but in the narrowing of perspective that had crept into his leadership. He had grown distant from the very people he claimed to serve. The voice of the public became muffled. The needs of the citizen became filtered through layers of protocol. He had once believed that his presence on a battlefield was enough to secure loyalty, that his ideas alone could guide a continent. But in the end, no man, no matter how brilliant, can hold the weight of a nation alone. Still, the question remained, was there another way? Could the France he had inherited, broken, bleeding, and divided, have survived without the strong hand he offered? The revolution had left more than ideals. It had left scars, mistrust, and political fragmentation. The Directory, before his rise, had floundered. Elections were chaotic. Coups were frequent. There was no consensus. In that void, he had brought unity. But unity through domination carries its own risk. In his case, the very methods that secured early victories also sowed the seeds of collapse. The reliance on military solutions to diplomatic problems. The suppression of opposition in favor of national pride. The belief that past success ensured future infallibility. By centralizing everything, he had created a system that could not function without him. And when he stumbled, in Russia, in Spain, at Leipzig, at Waterloo, there was no institution strong enough to absorb the shock. Power, once so vast, collapsed with sudden silence. He also came to reflect on his treatment of others. Those who had followed him, his marshals, his ministers, his family, had been lifted by his success but often discarded when they failed him. Loyalty was rewarded, but only while it remained absolute. Criticism, even when valid, was rarely tolerated. He had demanded much from others, but gave little room for their growth beyond his own orbit. He began to understand that leadership was not merely about commanding others, but about building something that could last beyond the individual. In this, perhaps, he had failed most clearly. He left no structure that could endure his absence, no succession plan, no stable handoff. Even his son, the King of Rome, was never given a chance to rule. Power that is not shared is power that dies with the holder. But he also thought of what had been achieved. France had changed under his rule. Feudal rights had been abolished. The legal system had been unified. The roads were improved. The finances stabilized. The administrative divisions of France, its departments and prefectures, still held. Education had a new structure. Merit had replaced inheritance in civil service. These were not illusions. They were facts. And though he had fallen, these structures had not. They had endured revolutions, restorations, and republics. They had become part of French life, normalized, natural, expected. So the legacy of his power was not entirely personal. It had flowed into the systems he left behind. He also considered the role of image. Napoleon had always understood the value of symbolism. From his coronation in Notre Dame, where he placed the crown on his own head, to the portraits of him astride rearing horses, to the titles he bestowed upon family and generals, every detail was deliberate. He knew that power was not only exercised, but performed. And this performance had worked. It had inspired loyalty, fear, pride, and unity. But it had also created distance. The man who had once shared bread with soldiers in a muddy tent became a figure in a golden carriage. The closer he moved to legend, the farther he moved from reality. He could see now how this had hardened resistance. How foreign rulers, once willing to negotiate, began to fear what his image represented. How alliances formed not simply against France, but against what he had become, what he seemed to be. Perhaps, in the end, the greatest challenge of power is knowing when to stop, when to give back what was taken, when to listen rather than speak, when to step aside. It is not a skill many leaders possess, certainly not those who reach as high as he had. And yet, as he sat in exile, gazing out over the waters of St. Helena, far from the noise of courts and councils, he began to see the clarity that had eluded him in the halls of power. He did not write these things down plainly. Pride still held his pen. But in quiet moments, in conversations with his few companions, fragments of regret surfaced. He missed France. Not just the capital or the palaces, but the streets, the sound of voices, the energy of a country constantly becoming something new. He had always believed in France's greatness, not as an empire, but as a people, a spirit, a force. And despite all he had done, he still loved it. Even after exile, even after defeat, he wanted to be remembered not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order, of law, of national pride. Whether the world would see him that way, he could not control. History would judge. Power, after all, does not write its own obituary. That task belongs to time. Chapter 15: The Man Behind the Myth. When the dust of war had settled, when the banners were folded away and the uniforms packed into drawers, what remained of Napoleon Bonaparte was not simply a legacy of campaigns or governments. What remained, more enduring than battlefield lines or royal decrees, was something far less tangible but no less powerful: the myth. Yet beneath that myth was a man. And understanding that man beyond the legend, beyond the image carved in marble or painted on horseback, requires stepping back from the noise and looking at what lay beneath the surface. He was born on August 15, 1769, in Ajaccio, a town on the island of Corsica, just months after it had been sold by Genoa to France. His family was noble in name but modest in wealth, proud of their heritage yet navigating a shifting political world. Corsica was not French in culture or spirit. Its people were fiercely independent, and so too was the boy who would become one of history's most studied figures. In school, Napoleon was an outsider. His accent marked him. His manners, shaped by the rocky Mediterranean island, made him a curiosity among the sons of continental elites. He studied in Brienne, then in Paris, always with a sense of distance between himself and the rest. But that distance forged something useful: focus. He read voraciously. Mathematics, geography, classical history, the lives of Caesar, Alexander, and the great empires of antiquity. He admired their tactics, their clarity of thought, their will to shape the world around them. He did not charm with ease. His letters, even in youth, were often abrupt. He could be intense, cold, private. But within him stirred ambition, not simply for fame, but for direction. He did not want to drift. He wanted to build. As a young artillery officer, he grasped something that many of his peers missed: That victory was not just about courage, but about coordination. The precise placement of cannon, the timing of movements, the ability to use terrain, these mattered as much as bravery, perhaps more. And so, early on, he gained a reputation not just for boldness, but for insight. By the time he seized the national spotlight at Toulon, he had already begun to imagine a larger stage. But he remained always something of a contradiction. He could be shy in salons, but fiery in councils. He spoke softly, but with absolute authority. He dismissed flattery, but surrounded himself with symbols of grandeur. He read Enlightenment philosophers and ruled as a centralized monarch. He preached merit, yet elevated family members to crowns. Some saw him as cold, unable to form deep friendships, unwilling to yield. Others spoke of his warmth in private moments, his playful humor, his sensitivity to insult and loyalty. To his soldiers, he was the little corporal, a term of affection and closeness. He walked among them, listened to their complaints, remembered their regiments. He did not sit above them on horseback at all times. He marched beside them when needed. He shared their discomforts. They loved him for it. To his marshals, he was often both inspiration and frustration. He demanded total focus. He expected brilliance. He gave praise rarely and punishment quickly. But when he shared credit, it meant something. When he offered a promotion, it came with weight. To his wives, Josephine and later Marie-Louise, he was complex, devoted, then distant, passionate, then preoccupied. He loved Josephine deeply, yet divorced her for the sake of an heir. He cared for Marie-Louise, yet kept her on the periphery of his political life. He was never indifferent, but he was often elsewhere, his mind always turning toward the next move, the next piece on the board. And he was not without fear. He feared disloyalty. He feared stagnation. He feared the slow decay of ambition. And perhaps, most of all, he feared irrelevance. This fear drove him as much as his vision did. It drove him to return from Elba, knowing the odds, knowing the risks. It drove him to stand once more before the people of France and ask them to follow him, not because he promised peace, but because he promised motion. He did not go quietly, because he never believed he had finished. To understand the man behind the myth is to understand someone who is always in motion, not just physically across maps and oceans, but intellectually. He was constantly revising, refining, testing ideas. He studied agriculture while in power. He reformed postal routes. He examined military uniforms. He proposed changes to street lighting in Paris. Nothing was too large or too small to escape his notice. But this tendency also meant that he found rest difficult. Sleep, for Napoleon, was short and infrequent. He often rose before dawn, wrote notes, dictated orders, sketched thoughts. His age struggled to keep pace. Some saw this as a kind of genius, others as an inability to stop. He believed in destiny, not in the mystical sense, but in the idea that certain people were called to shape history. He saw himself in that light, not as a man obeying chance, but as someone pushing through it. Yet he did not romanticize failure. He studied defeats. He memorized errors. He fired generals who repeated mistakes. He accepted responsibility when cornered, but always looked ahead. What he did not tolerate was betrayal. Nothing stung more than being abandoned by those he had elevated. When former allies turned against him, especially during the collapse in 1814, he did not weep, but he remembered. He marked them. He sealed them in memory. He had a sense of legacy, even in life. He collected artifacts. He commissioned portraits. He monitored what newspapers said. He controlled the public narrative. This was not vanity for its own sake, but a kind of historical self-awareness. He knew people would study him. He intended to shape what they found. And yet, he was not without vulnerability. He suffered from stomach ailments, likely worsened by stress and poor diet. He was sensitive to climate. His health faltered during long campaigns. He could lose his temper when exhausted, retreat into silence when anxious. Those who spent long stretches near him saw moments of reflection, quiet meals, walks without words. Hands folded behind his back as he looked not at a map, but at a horizon. He knew what solitude felt like, not just in exile, but even at the height of his reign. Power isolates. It surrounds the leader with symbols, with formality, with layers. He could issue commands to thousands, yet speak his mind fully only to a handful. He had a son, born to great fanfare, the King of Rome, yet he spent barely any time with him. His exile ensured distance. The child grew up in Vienna, under a different name, in a different culture, with little sense of the man who had fathered him. This, too, shaped the man behind the myth, the knowledge that the world he built could not be inherited. That legacy, in blood, would not last. So he tried to craft another kind of inheritance, one of laws, of institutions, of symbols. He did not live to see how deeply these would endure. Today, historians argue over his true nature. Was he a reformer who lost his way in war? A soldier who became trapped in the machinery of politics? A ruler shaped by circumstance, or a man who reshaped the circumstances themselves? There are no final answers. What is clear is that the myth of Napoleon persists not because of the size of his battles, but because of the scale of his contradiction. He was both modern and imperial, both democratic in rhetoric and autocratic in action. He drew from the revolution, but crowned himself. He loved France, but controlled it with iron rule. He inspired soldiers and terrified kings. He was not merely a reflection of his age. He bent that age to fit him. And that bending, that reshaping left marks that no exile could erase. When people today walk through the streets of Paris, they pass buildings he commissioned, institutions he structured, streets he ordered paved. When they study law in Europe, they encounter the systems he helped establish. When they read military history, they begin and end with his campaigns. Yet all of that, all the noise, all the symbols, returns eventually to a single person. Not a statue, not a myth, but a man. A boy from Corsica who grew into a figure the world could not forget. A man who once stood in the cold morning fog before battle, who listened to the march of boots, the rustle of flags, the silence before the first cannon fired. He lived and breathed those moments. He shaped them. And even now, long after his voice was silenced, long after his empire faded into memory, the world still listens for the echo of that step, that decision, that presence. In the end, the man behind the myth was not perfect. He was not invincible. He was not eternal, but he was real. And perhaps, in history, that is the most enduring myth of all. That a single man, through force of will, can rise above circumstance, command the tides of change, and leave something behind that refuses to fade.